Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I am back in my office creating another video in my Hammock Camping 101 series. And today I'm going to be talking about the things that I don't like about hammock camping. For those who follow the channel know that I love hammock camping and prefer it to sleep in a tent. However, there are a few things that I don't like and are a bit of a hassle when compared to a tent. Now, obviously, these things aren't major. I still prefer my hammock as a shelter when I go backpacking. But there are a few things that you might want to consider if you're new to hammock camping. So let's get into it. These are the top 5 things that I don't like about hammock camping when compared to a tent. The first dislike is the fiddle factor. If you're going to get into hammock camping, beware of the fiddle factor. Well, what is that? Well, that's all the fiddling that you have to do once you get to camp to get your hammock set up properly so that you're protected from any storms, as well as you getting the proper hang so you can sleep well at night. There's a lot of fiddling and adjusting that is required. The first thing you have to look at are your hammock suspensions. How high or low on the tree are they? How far apart are your trees? Am I sitting too low? Am I sitting too high? Well, that is dependent upon, how high or low your suspensions are, or maybe how tight or how loose they are. And so you'll need to go back and forth, adjusting those until you get the proper hang that you're looking for. Then once your hammock is set up, there's some fiddling around with your tarp. So you hang your tarp over your tent, and now you got to think about, well, are there trees in the way? Do I want to go into porch mode? Is there a storm tonight? Do I pitch it low? Do I pitch it wide? Do I pitch it high? There's a lot of different ways that you can pitch your tarp over your tent that you need to consider. And then when you're putting it on, well, maybe it's too far left at first. And so then you move it a little too far right to make sure that you have good coverage on both your head and your foot end of your hammock. Then once you have your tarp set up, then you look to your underquilt. As you know, with a traditional underquilt, you have all these cords that you would need to attach to the end of your continuous loop. And you got to think about, well, do I sleep right to left or do I sleep left to right? Do I need to cinch my underquilt on my left side and loosen it on my right, or vice versa? And again, you're looking for to make sure that your head is covered and that your feet are covered, to make sure that you're going to get the warmth that you want when you sleep that night. So this is a lot of fiddling around with your hammock while your buddy's sitting over there in their tent, relaxed. They've got it pitched in probably a couple minutes, especially the freestanding and semi-standing tents. They're pitched in a couple minutes, and now they're relaxing, laying down in their tent while you're fiddling around with your hammock. One of the things that I do to offset this is that I don't set everything up immediately when I get to camp. Because to me, the bonus of having a hammock is it's also a seat where I can get my feet off of the ground. So the thing that I will do is I'll just pitch my hammock and not worry about all the rest of the stuff. I don't worry about having a proper hang. I just want to get my feet off the ground and just rest in my hammock a little bit after a long day of hiking. And I can do that in maybe a minute, 2 minutes. That's not going to take me long at all. So then maybe later on in the evening when I'm done resting, then I will begin to, do all the fiddling around. The worst is maybe if you're getting into camp late at night and you're just going to go straight to bed. Well, then you got to do all that fiddling around with your suspensions, with your tarp, with your underquilt, and get all that ready in place so that you will be protected, so that you will be warm at night and that you will sleep comfortably. So just be aware that there is a lot of fiddling around when it comes to having a hammock as your shelter when compared to a tent. The second dislike that I have for hammock camping is there's no room to spread out. And that just may be a personal preference of mine, is that I like to keep things organized. Like everything has its place. Whereas my son, when he gets to camp, he doesn't mind just spreading things all over the campsite. Well, I don't like doing that. Well, in a tent, it seems like, you can take your backpack and you can kind of empty your contents all over that tent. It's still contained, And then you can even organize it in your tent and have things spread out a little bit. I know for me, when I go hammock camping, I'll keep things in different corners, whether I want electronics or different clothes by my head, or maybe my backpack or some other things down by my feet. And I have a little bit of more organization where I can spread things out. Well, that's a bit harder in a hammock because obviously you can't just dump your contents into your hammock and then sit in there or go to sleep. So how I, counter that a bit is I have different accessories on my hammocks. So one thing I have is a hammock organizer, which allows me to keep things that I can easily access during the night, whether it's a flashlight or bear spray or maybe a beanie or something to keep my head warm at night. That helps me keep things organized. I even have a shelf that goes behind my head, and typically I'll put maybe additional warm clothing at night that I want to reach, maybe my down socks so I can easily access them. And the one thing I really love about my Dutch Chameleon is the side sling. The side sling is somewhere where I can dump the contents of my backpack in there and then have access to them. Again, it's not all spread out where I can easily see them. I'll kind of have to, shuffle through it. But it's better than just keeping it in my backpack, because I hang my backpack either at the foot of my hammock or underneath me, like on a butt pad to keep it off the dirt. And so I like having this side sling where I can easily get things like maybe my raincoat, my puffy, or something like that during the middle of the night. But I just can't spread out. I can't have everything spread out for me when you're sleeping in a hammock. It's not all necessarily contained in one place like you can in a tent. That's why I do use the accessories. That really helps me out. So just know, have that thought in your mind of what are you going to do with your stuff? How are you going to organize things at camp? What are you going to do with your backpack? These are just a few additional things that you need to consider when you go hammock camping because you don't have the luxury of a tent to just put everything in there and spread out as you may want to. My third dislike of hammock camping is less privacy. I feel like when I go hammock camping, I don't have as much privacy as I would if I were, sleeping in a tent. And this is for things like, changing clothes, or maybe you're dealing with a hygiene issue, in certain private areas that you want to address in private because you've been chafing all day and you just need a little bit of privacy to deal with some of the issues that you may encounter on the trail. So for me, I feel like that's a lot easier done in the privacy of your tent than it is in a hammock. And if you've seen other videos of mine, you know that I bring camp clothes, so I need a place to change. And typically, if I'm solo hiking, this is not a big deal. Or if I'm just with one of my buddies, it's not a big deal. But a lot of times, you're hiking or camping around other hikers. And you could be in a campsite where there's multiple people around in different camp spots. Or you could be, you're 100 feet, 200 feet off the trail, but you see people hiking up and down the trail all the time. And you need a little bit of privacy. When I'm backpacking with my son, I'm not dropping trowel in front of my son. That's not going to happen. And especially if he has friends or if I'm in with mixed company, maybe I'm backpacking with another couple, with my wife, I just need to have some privacy when I'm changing clothes or dealing with some hygiene issues from that day on the trail. And the hammock really doesn't provide the best privacy as compared to a tent. So typically what I do is I'll stand behind my tarp. So I'll make sure my tarp is pitched and I'll go change behind my tarp or behind a tree. I do have to be mindful of, again, other campers, hikers on the nearby trail. I just have to be mindful of my environment and, be sure that I'm having the privacy that I want to take care of the things that I need to do in private. So that's just something that for you to consider. If you're getting into hammock camping, what is your plan? If you decide to bring camp clothes, what is your plan for changing clothes? What are you going to do if you need to handle some specific hygiene issues? Be mindful about how you're going to address those things on trail, knowing that you're not going to have as much privacy as you would in a tent and that you can deal with in a hammock. My fourth dislike of hammock camping is no camping above tree line. Obviously, if you go hammock camping, you need trees. And for the most part, I don't like camping above tree line, especially out here in Colorado at such higher elevations. It's windier, it tends to be colder, and the storms are a little bit more unpredictable. And I like having shelter, finding shelter in the trees. However, there are those times when you're on trail and you just see that perfect camp spot, and there's no trees. You have this perfect view. I remember one time I was in North Carolina and my son and I were backpacking a part of the Appalachian Trail. We were hiking from Max Patch to Hot Springs, North Carolina. Well, Max Patch has this beautiful wide open area with 360-degree views, and tons of people were out there and just kind of enjoying the sunset and the sunrise the next morning. I'd have loved to been able to been out there. We had to go to Treeline and we camped there, and then we just ate our dinner out there, but then we had to go back to our hammocks. So there's times like that where having a hammock is kind of a bummer. I'd have loved to have been on top of Max Patch and experiencing that sunrise and the sunset from my shelter. And you see those sometimes. You see those campsites and those pictures where people are, where there are no trees and they have these amazing open views where, you pitch a tent. Can't do that with a hammock. Hammock, you have to be a little more mindful of where you are camping. So for me, it takes a lot more pre-planning for a hammock because I have to know, are there trees in that area? And where are the trees? A lot of times when you're with a tent and you're in dispersed camping, you just go and hike until you get tired and maybe you find a nice spot and you pitch a tent and you go from there. Well, for me, especially out here in Colorado, there are times where I may have a 5-10 mile stretch where there are no trees. And so I have to be very mindful of where are the trees? Where can I hang? And I do a little bit more planning of my days to know where I can camp because I do need trees. I can't camp above tree line. Now, with that said, I've had some pretty amazing campsites from my hammock. The latest being in the Grand Tetons. I had this beautiful stream going by and the sun is hitting the top of the Grand Teton. It was probably the best campsite I've ever had, and I loved it. So you can still find beautiful sites, beautiful campsites with your hammock, but they're not going to be above tree line. The fifth thing I dislike about hammock camping is this feeling of being less secure from wildlife coming into your camp. Now, I do think this is a false security because that flimsy material of your tent is not going to hold back a bear, a raccoon, or a mountain lion from getting in your tent if you have scented items in there or food that they're trying to come after. It's not going to stop them. Just like it's not, my hammock and my tarp is not going to stop them. The thing I think where you get the false security about the tent is that you don't see them, right? Especially if your doors are pitch closed and you have total privacy. You can hear things in your campsite, obviously, right? But you're not necessarily can see them coming on. So for when you're in a hammock, the thing that is so nice about having a hammock is that you can see everywhere. I mean, I love having a hammock because I feel like I'm sleeping outside and I can see the stars and I can see my entire environment around me. So I love that. But the flip side is that is if there is wildlife that comes into your site, you're going to see them as well. And you may feel less secure and less protection, as you know, an animal can come right up to your face, sniffing your hammock, and what are you going to do, right? You're coming eye to eye with whatever that wildlife is. You know, for me, I've never had any encounters like that in my campsite. The worst is a porcupine that came walking underneath my hammock one time, but that wasn't too scary. The scariest time was when I was on the Colorado Trail and I heard coyotes howling. So I was just beginning to fall asleep, and I heard this one single coyote that was coming from my right. And then I heard a pack of coyotes that were howling on my left. Well, I could tell that this single coyote was trying to get back to their pack, and they kept howling back and forth. Well, that single coyote felt like it was coming closer and closer to my hammock. Now my tarp was pinched down low, so I didn't see it that well, but it sounded like it was within 15, 20 feet. And it may have been 100 feet. I don't know. But it definitely made me nervous that this coyote could just walk right underneath my tarp and start sniffing me. You know, that's why I'm very, very cautious about not having any scented items on me in my pocket whatsoever and hanging them a good distance away, because I don't want wildlife in my camp when I'm sleeping at night. Well, eventually that coyote got to my left side and eventually joined its pack. But that's probably the most nervous that I have ever been. So I think there's just this feeling of not being as secure in a hammock because you're just more exposed to it. You can see the entire the area, the campsite of things coming into your camp. Because trust me, I know things come through the camp all the time, especially when I'm sleeping. And when you're in a tent, you're just not as exposed to that because the tent walls are, you know, preventing you from seeing that. You may hear things, but you're not seeing it. So I know that happens all the time. But that's kind of one of my biggest fears is waking up in the night and all of a sudden I see glowing eyes at me inside my hammock. But I do think this is a false security that a tent provides, as that whatever that wildlife animal is can get into your tent just as easily as it can get into my hammock. So that's number 5, is having that, you know, I feel a little less secure being in a hammock than I would be in a tent. Well, that's going to do it for this video. Those are the top 5 things that I dislike most about hammock camping. Like I said before, these are not major things. These are pretty minor. They don't dissuade me from sleeping in a hammock. I definitely prefer sleeping in a hammock over than sleeping on the ground in a tent. And the thing I do love about the hammock camping, it does feel like you're sleeping outside. You have a view of the stars. You have a view of the mountains at the sunset, wherever you're at in your hammock. And that's one of the things I love about hammock camping, as well as I get my best night's sleep. I feel the most rested. So I definitely prefer hammock camping. But just be mindful that there are these things that you're going to have to deal with if you are hammock camping, which may be a little bit harder than if you are sleeping in a tent.